Interviews are one of the most commonly requested services for videographers and video production companies. Today, I'm going to walk you through our process for setting up and executing a basic video interview. Welcome back to the Hill and Valley YouTube channel. We are a production company based in Rochester, New York, and we recently hosted an event at our studio called Cameras and Coffee. It's an event where we invite the local community and fellow filmmakers and photographers to our studio and drink coffee and chat about the industry and our local scene. At this event, I hosted a live demonstration of how we set up video interviews. Today, I'm going to be going a little bit more in depth on that, as well as showing you some of the footage from that event. A basic interview setup, and the reason I chose an interview as the form of video to kind of go over is that we find it's one of the most common uses of video when you're working with other businesses or most types of clients. Whether it's shooting for a brand story or for documentaries, I feel like it's just one of the more approachable and more common uses of video in today's industry. Obviously, things will be a little bit different when you're shooting on location versus on a cyc. I'm not going to go into much detail about the cyc wall specifically, try and keep it generic so that you can apply these tips to wherever you're filming an interview. So the first thing you want to do when you're setting up an interview is grab your main camera. I usually think of the widest angle lens as my main camera, just because that's the angle where you're going to see the most. The reason I like to start with this is because you have the most to consider and you need to make the most decisions about how you want your image to look and how you want to decorate or rearrange your environment. Pick your second camera angle. In this case, we usually use a tighter lens on the second angle. Again, with the cyc doesn't really matter, but you usually have more leeway with how you position your second angle because you're using a tighter lens. So the background is more blurred out, less distracting, and there's just less area that your lens is covering. For video interviews, you always want to use at least two cameras. And the reason for this is it gives you options to cut back and forth between in your edit. For example, if you were shooting an interview with just one camera and you needed to cut out some words, or if somebody coughs or stumbles while answering a question, but you really want to use that take, you would have to make a cut, and in the edit it might seem kind of strange with a jump cut going from the same frame to another moment from that same frame. With two cameras, you can switch the angle and make it a much more seamless transition in the edit. Start by picking your main camera angle and placing your subject in the frame. In this case, because it's a white cyc, there's basically no information behind your subject, so the background isn't really important. In most situations, you want to have a decent amount of space between your subject and their background. This allows you to have more control over how out of focus your background is using your camera's aperture, as well as gives you an advantage on lighting your subject and the background separately with different light sources. But typically what I do is kind of scout the location first and look for nice looking backgrounds that don't require a lot of set design and additional lighting, just make things easier on yourself and pick the most pleasant looking background. At our studio, we use only Sony camera bodies, and in this instance we were using our Sony FX9 and our Sony a7S III. We chose these two cameras because they're two of our highest quality cameras and their images are similar enough that it's pretty easy to cut between them. Once you get your camera set up, you're going to want to introduce a light into your scene. I always start with the key light because, and if you're unfamiliar with what a key light is, it's basically just your light source that is the brightest and providing most of the shape and direction of the lighting on your subject. So we usually like to light from one side or the other. Because of the position of the light, we're generating shadows on her face. If the light was right in front of her, or basically coming from the same direction as your camera, yes, your subject would be well illuminated, but I personally don't think there's that interesting of a light shape when the light is just being blasted from the front. It's kind of similar to like an on-camera flash sort of look, but for video. In this demonstration, we were using a Nanlite FS300, and this light had a 90 centimeter parabolic softbox on it with a grid. And because we are on a cyc, I chose to use a smaller softbox and a grid on it, and the grid just helps keep the light focused and more directional. If you notice, the light is really only focused on alley and there's not a ton of light spill on the cyc, which was the intention here because white surfaces reflect a lot of light and I wanted to keep this as controlled as possible. We'll also need a background light. For this, we used another FS300, but with a 120 centimeter lantern softbox on it. The reason we chose this modifier is that we were shooting into the curve of a cyc wall. And so with that curve, we want to spread the light as evenly as possible across that space. The lantern softbox is really good at achieving that. Your background light, I think, is gonna kind of change the most depending on your location. Because some locations, if you have like an interesting looking wall that has a lot of texture, you might just want to throw a bare bulb or a light without any modifier on it at an angle to bring out the texture and keep that background interesting. Other times you might just want to blast a lot of soft light to illuminate the area. A lot of times you can get away with just shooting a light up into the ceiling to bounce light around the entire room. In this case, I'm just trying to spread light evenly across the background. So next I'm just going to talk about the fill here. Depending on your lighting situation, it might be best to use an additional light for a fill, or a lot of times, we do most often, is to use a bounce card. Bounce card can basically be any bright, preferably white surface that you can manipulate around your scene to bounce light back onto your subject. I really like using bounce cards because it keeps the difference between your key light and your fill light looking natural. Because if you think about it, the light that's being reflected off of your card is never going to be more than the light emitted from that original source. So as long as you're positioning them correctly, it will usually have a very natural look, as if someone was standing next to a white wall, for example. For our final light, we are going to add a hair light. For our hair light, we boomed in a Nanlite 2-foot tube light. And I like using these for hair lights because they're small and compact, easy to fit into your space. With this particular tube light, it has an RGB mode as well as a CCT mode, so we were able to change the color temperature of that light to be similar to a tungsten light source. I really like doing this when your key light and background light are set to daylight because it adds a little bit of color contrast as well as lighting contrast in your scene. Although we're not recording audio right now to show you guys, just some general tips about boom pole placement. We almost always use a boom pole with a shotgun microphone on it for our interviews because that's the highest quality microphone we have and usually what yields the best results. Positioning this microphone correctly is crucial. If your microphone is positioned behind your subject or maybe at the top of their head, your audio is going to sound a bit muffled. If the mic is positioned too far in front of your subject, you might get a lot of echoes from your room and it might sound like their voice is distant. In my experience, the best place to position your microphone is about 2 to 3 inches in front of your subject's mouth. This ensures that if they're moving around a little bit when they're talking, your audio signal is going to remain mostly consistent. Also, you want to be careful when you're placing your boom pole that it's not creating shadows on your subject. A lot of times we'll also use a lavalier mic, like the one I'm wearing, basically as a backup audio source, or sometimes if you're in a scenario where there's a director on the shoot and they really want the wide angle to be very wide and you don't have room to put a boom pole above the person. Lavaliers are a great choice for that as well. The example I showed in this demonstration was for a pretty generic, probably corporate video interview. But interviews can get creative. You can play around with contrast ratios, adding or removing your fill light to make your subject's face look a little bit more dramatic, maybe invite the viewer to take them a little bit more seriously. Or you can play around with your background light as well. Say, for example, you are filming a murder documentary. You could turn off your background light, eventually. You get a much more dramatic look with an underlit cyc. So you can achieve this in many ways in different locations, depending on what your background is. But that's just something to be mindful of when you're setting up your interview. What is the intention of this video? What do you want people to feel when they're watching this video? So I usually dial in the lights that will be hitting my subject first, and then I kind of address the ambience of the room and decide how we want that to feel. Additionally, if you're doing something a little more creative and less corporate, you can replace your background using colored lights. And I enjoy using colored lights a lot. It lets you completely change the look of a scene just by adding one light. When you do this, you can light your subject with daylight balanced lights, keeping the light on them looking natural, but then add some character or flavor to your background with the colored lights. Especially if you're using a background that is mostly white, this gives you a lot of control when using your colored lights, as it completely fills that space with that color. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful to you in some way and you were able to learn something from it. If you want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to our channel. And if you have any questions about any of the topics I talked about or suggestions of your own, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please leave it a like, and I will see you next time.